Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so glad that I have this opportunity to create a little bit of a conversation about some policy and posty thinking and post-structural thoughts, all kind of mashed up together in an assemblage of thought. And for the way that I'm going to go about doing this presentation, I've created kind of um, a hybrid modality of presenting. So I am going to show the video of me doing my presentation, so that in the meanwhile, all of us can be in the chat and can at any time ask me questions or um, post a thought or an idea that kind of becomes salient in the midst of the presentation. So I will get to be doing my presentation at the same time as participating as a viewer and as somebody who can just be in the conversation with you as well. So I am going to invite you to go ahead and open up your chat, and that way you have it there available to you. And I'll just pause for a moment for you to do that. Thank you. Okay, so I am going to begin my presentation.
Hello, thank you so much for joining me for this session. My name is Liv. I'm from Winthrop University, and I would love to talk to you about some ideas about how maybe artist teachers make sense of policy or how they work through policy fog in this data-driven and accountability-obsessed era that we live in. And also maybe some ideas about thinking about research becoming anti-reductionist, or how it can become expansive, where like doing the research doesn't reduce the thinking or the experience or the data into something smaller, but encourages the outcome to become even larger than the threshold. Let's just start with the story about how when I was teaching high school art, I asked a question about assessment and grading, and how all of that kind of opened up this wide array of questions about why am I doing what I'm doing in this grade book? What do these grades have to do with making the art, and how I interact with my students and how they generate their thinking? And what does all of this produce when I'm asking about these grades? So I then started to move my scholarly thinking out of like just how am I grading and what am I grading, but to who's asking me to grade, and is there really that big they out there, and what languages and things have kind of materialized in my position that has communicated to me uh, what it is that I have to do, and where those boundaries are, and things like that. So the assemblage in this title alludes to both the assemblage of assembling different thoughts and theories together from Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari and other post-structural thinkers to practice, to thinking about practice theories in art ed, like Melanie Buffington and Sarah K. Wilson Kay and Goody. And then also in the assemblage is using theories from policy research like Vidovich, and then even going so far as to looking at Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism in pedagogy. So the assemblage is both an allusion to the different assemblage of theories used in order to look at how policy is manipulated, navigated in the post, but also the assemblage of just like making sense of art, using art to make sense of things. So again, here is an idea about the assemblage that we have to live with the idea of confusions and ambiguities and values and conflicts that happen in our practice as artist teachers, and that there is this kind of notion that we are operating outside of the forces of power, but that it's possible that maybe we do have a little bit more agency within how we conduct our practice. But also, researchers have to live with confusions and ambiguities and value conflicts in this postmodern world. So I started to link together both my, thinking about being a research, like how to do the research and how we do the art, and also how we do the teaching too. So, so I started to think about that and how, just to circle back to when I was teaching high school, I was asking the question, like, who's telling me that I have to do these things, and what does that mean? I had generated lots of assumptions about the convolution of policies affecting my practice. And, I got to tell you, although I knew very little about the policies and where they came from, I knew for the most part that they weren't really written with like production pedagogies like art, drama, music, culinary, robotics, industrial engineering, like in mind, but rather were really written in the frame of the policy maker's idea of school. So a lot of these policies were written about like this fantastic notion of what school is and does, but rather we as in the production of pedagogies, don't necessarily align with a fantastic view, a fantasy view of art, of education. So, just seeing this, it really kind of gets at some of the tensions that brings up and the affect that kind of comes with that. This piece was made by my friend Cheryl Lammy. She you can see it's two people canoeing, and one of them with a paintbrush, and the one in the front of the canoe saying, remind me again, why are we doing this? And the person in the back says, shut up, damn it, just paddle faster. And I think that really gets a lot at how we feel about doing some of these doing some of the things that we're beholden to for policies that we maybe don't really have us in mind. So Stephen Ball talks a little bit about how when we are working in the policy realm, that we exist in this third space of translation, where we are the ones who have to translate from understanding the policy to putting it into practice. So it's a different space and a different type of action, and he calls it enacting, but that he works through the idea that it is this third space. And so teachers might be somewhat unique in that they have to use their translation skills a little bit more, with a little bit more creativity, maybe a little bit more fidelity in some expectations. So Stephen Ball goes on to encourage us to think, and this is a conceptual framework that I was kind of using to understand, my tensions with policy and how I was working as a high school art teacher, and grading and all of these other things that didn't quite agree with the pedagogy that I believed in. And so as I dug into it, then this is the framework that seemed to make the best sense. And that he says that schools are complex and that they're sometimes incoherent social assemblages, and that they have possibilities of context. Policies are not simply ideational or ideological. They're very material. Policies rarely tell you what to do, and they rarely dictate or determine practice, but some do more than others, narrow range of creative responses. So what that kind of alluded to me is that if some more than others narrow the range of creative responses, then some allow for creative responses. And I figured that it's possible that maybe artist teachers are kind of taking up some of that creative space in between policy and practice as translators. And so what might that mean? What that might mean for artist teachers? He says, this is in part because policy texts are typically written in relation to the best of all possible schools, schools that only exist in the fevered imaginations of politicians, civil servants, and advisors in relation to fantastical contexts. These texts cannot simply be implemented. They have to be translated from text to action, put into practice. But practice is sophisticated, and it's contingent, and it's complex, and it's unstable. So policy will open up to erosion and undercutting by action, the embodied agency of the people who are its object. So this mimicked, to me, the idea of bricolage, of making collage, of the old and the new and the piecing together and the undoing. But it seemed like the actioning of all of these things kind of mimicked that. So the pages of magazines that we use, or the ads, or the perfect sketchbook papers that we use in order to create collages or bricollages, kind of are those perfected, the fantasy, the perfect ideation of things, idealized things, but that we kind of take them apart upon our own agency and recombine them to make new and to make sense. So in that way, we kind of become the artist, or the bricoleur, or the assemblage artist of policy, and Koyama agrees. What I asked of practicing artist teachers, about 40 of them, I was in a Midwestern state doing a statewide conference, was I did a really short lecture, and I showed the picture that my friend Cheryl Lammy had made, the one at the beginning with the canoe. I showed them that picture, and I asked them, like, here's how Cheryl Lammy made a metaphor of how she makes sense of the era of accountability at work in her current art ed position, and I asked, what about your natural art making process mimics how you're a policy bricoleur? So I used her. She called that piece Up a Creek. I used her example to try to give practicing artist teachers the opportunity to kind of make sense of the policy fog that they live in, and the assemblage of policies, with what I call policy residue. So I had the policy residue all over the table. So it was things like standards and rubrics and timelines and school calendars and anything that had kind of an essence of a structure or policy that we are all beholden. So they were welcome to draw, paint, make marks upon the policy artifacts, the policy residue as they pleased. So then 12 of the collages were photographed before they left the room, and to go to another session during their conference. So they were just kind of voluntarily offering up examples. So one of them was called Sfumato, and so as a researcher, what I started to do here was to use thinking with theory, which is kind of an actionable way to look at what could be data. And when you do that, you take a theory and kind of use it as what Jackson and Metzai call like brain furniture. And so you look at the data with that particular arrangement of thoughts and ideas. And so I used a few different theories to look at these pieces, at this piece. So as I said earlier, I used some practice theory, which is like focused on art education, and I use some policy theory, which is focused on how we analyze and how policy embodiments and policies move, if you will. And the third one is more of like a social theory about kind of post-structuralist theory. So I collaged or bricolaged together these different theories, and then I used those as brain furniture to investigate some of the outcomes here. And doing so actually opened up new thoughts. So one of the outcomes was a Sfumato was one, and another was this piece, which is just titled "What the Hell," and this was produced by another practicing art teacher in that moment. And this comic kind of asks, like, what the hell? Why schools are just asking for what he calls left brain thinkers, and so that they can label and measure and quantify it. If they can't label and measure and quantify, then it must not be important, right? It's like telling somebody who found the most amazingly beautiful butterfly to stab it through and put it on a board so that they can study it. But actually, the truth is that the beauty is in seeing it as it is, where it is, and how it behaves and moves about. So thinking with theory and looking at this piece generated some of the outcomes that you see there in that grid. That there's some things about exploring and finding it without killing it, and that it pulls the ways of accountability out from outside of life, and it brings it into the frame of living. And so this piece is making an effort to blur the boundaries between policy and life, amongst many other things. So when you're working with thinking with theory, what you're doing is you're kind of folding together what they call folding together some different analytical questions that emerge as you're looking at it. So another thing that I did was, as I was thinking with theory, looking at Sfumato, I actually created new questions. And so then what I did was I moved those questions on top of the what the hell piece, and just to help me kind of see what questions are each of these pieces asking, and what are they asking of what are these pieces kind of developing in a way to analyze or understand the predicament of being an artist teacher and in these policies that are written without us in mind. So what then happened was that what emerged was kind of this murmuration of affect. I mean, you can't help it. You feel it. You feel what that artist teacher was thinking when he was saying, "What the hell?" And you feel how Sfumato just felt so, when she was making it, the ambiguity and the smokiness and the aloftness. And so you couldn't help but understand that there were some affects there. So I started spending more time looking at affect theory, and that's when Lauren Berlant's thinking about kind of the cruel optimism kind of came about. And cruel optimism is not as foreboding as I think it might sound, but rather it's that there's something about the standards and the different policies that we work within, that there's kind of this understood thing that if we just stick to the policy, then everything's going to be okay. And Lauren Berlant says, it's kind of our attachment to the policy that's kind of our problem. There are certain things about practices, policies that we just say, we need this certainty. And she's saying, maybe take your eyes and your focus off of that external thing as your point of departure for certainty, and that your certainty about that thing might be your impasse. So the cruelty is not that to enact an identity or a practice artist teacher outside of mandated standards leaves the practitioner aloft from being part of the field, and constructed certainly of success that the standards and other policies kind of promise. But in these two pieces, they kind of assert that there need to be an embracing of ambiguity, and to abandon this thrust of solvability, and that these assertions kind of exist between the object and what it's referring to, which again, to circle back, cruel optimism theory asks us to ask ourselves, bargains are made in order to stay in close proximity to the desired object. So if our object is, perfection or a 7 on things, what does that 7 really mean? And so this assemblage of theories really kind of, again, it does not reduce the problem of policy as lived practice as an artist teacher, but rather it starts to expand and get down into the minutia of that essence and what it might mean in affect and in practice and in policy as a policy, and then also like in art education as a field as well. So a question that I might ask is, could the standards or other mandated policies be captured by practitioners as both like a promise and as a possession? And what that means is could we, as we, how many times have you been asked to unpack your standards, right? So in that, when you do that, it's like almost if you do that, then there's kind of this underlying promise that things will go well. But at what point in time can unpacking those standards become more of your own creation? How can we articulate that a reframing of that needs to be made available so that in the act of doing that policy, of enacting that standard or that thing that we would then, it would be ours, and that it's as ours, then its promise becomes something more in line with our philosophies, our pedagogies, our intentions, our honest intentions for what art education is and does. So this would really require a rethinking of the way school does policies, not makes them, but does them. The actionable policy creations and enactments would have to be always contingent, fluid, and both owned by the enactors and the work as promises for a desired outcome. So then a while later, there was a moment when I ran into somebody that had been in that presentation and had made one of their collages, and here's a snapshot of what they said.
The way that you teach now, the way that you encounter policies, do you encounter them differently now than before when you took the moment to like tear, shred, question, realign?
I think I still encounter policies that way because I see policies as kind of like the baseline or the benchmark.
And then like you could always shoot for more or modify or change or tear apart or, maybe this would work better.
So yeah, I still think I see them as like, I like question them and, figure out which ones are more significant, which ones I see as more important, and then kind of work around them and in between them.
I was just thinking that anytime you get the opportunity to kind of wrestle visually with something that's unfamiliar, it helps you better understand it. So that activity, like I remember really vividly, was just very, that's an area that I don't really know a whole lot about until I took your class, really. That was like kind of the door being cracked open. So, we got to get in there and experiment with different ways of understanding these, policies and how they apply to us and how we may or may not have to address them very soon, like in our future. So, I think the purpose of the class was absolutely, like, I thought that it was achieved profoundly. I loved making things about a topic that was previously very scary.
So in that moment, I realized that we often don't take the time to just investigate the idea that there are policies surrounding our practice and that big fog around it might be a really good way to just like be more present about them, particularly now in the context that we're working in, in kind of this kind of liminal space between pandemic and post-pandemic art education. As we kind of move out of old paradigms and old structures and into new, if we take a moment to just I feel like right now in this moment, like we can feel and understand and get a sensation of the policies that affect our practice a little bit more clearly, just because we have very recently had to understand different policies, completely new ones or abandon old ones. And so the fog has been a bit cleared and a bit lifted. So if we take a moment to just see where they are and what they are doing, how those policies are producing different effects and affects within us and within our students, I think that that's something to consider. So right now, I see an opportunity that you policy bricoleurs are entrepreneurs, that your always already agentic selves can use art making to make visible the way that you embody and enact policy influences. And it's a really multifaceted and it's a theoretically border bounding endeavor, but that by you trying to wrestle with the policies that you have surrounding you now and how you make sense of them and to make it visible, can maybe create a participatory dialogic policy analysis, which means like together, if we all investigate what we're up to and what is up to working on us, that we might be able to find new ways to articulate that what needs to be done differently or what needs to change or what needs to stay. Maybe some of these practices and policies are good and they're being challenged, or maybe they are wrong and they desperately need to be challenged. But we right now, in no time has it ever been more important, nor has it been more available to us to make visible things that we might have chosen to or had been kind of alluded to, thinking that, you know, we just do as we're told. And
Hey guys, hi, it's Livia again, and I wanted to just briefly before I run out of time, I wanted to invite you all to do exactly that, to make visible the way that you make sense of the policies that are at work on you or with you in your practice, because I think that by doing so and by putting them somewhere important, put whatever that outcome is somewhere visible, somewhere that will spark conversations with anybody around you. I hope that you take the challenge up to do so. I think that a lot of the change that we need to make and that we can make happens in the small spaces between, and how we take up those small spaces between from one policy to another as practitioners, not just as thinkers and as provocateurs of change, but also like in the small spaces of our practice as well. And so if you can identify where some of those policy windows, those little policy cracks, and where you can swell up the space to do good inside of them, I think that we could be really onto something. Does anybody have a question in the last 30 seconds that I could answer, or any reactions that I...
So, Liv, thank you so much for the presentation. Actually, I enjoyed both part of the simultaneous review, video and chatting together. It's a really interesting new assemblage, like putting things different way of like, you know, presenting and hearing. And also I agree with a lot of like policy and, you know, has to be like, we have to have some liminal as space and challenge for that. So it's really important work, and hopefully to more hear about your work later too.
Oh boy, oh good. Oh, thank you for that affirmation. I appreciate it. It all comes from the fact that I was a high school teacher that was troubled by so many things that I was told to do, and then I got to thinking, I'm like, wait a minute, who's telling me how to do these things, you know? So it all came from there, and then now as a researcher, it's really been an exciting endeavor to dive into it from the scholarly angle, for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Livek Garner. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. For those who want to stick around for the next session, I'm going to put you all in the waiting room while we get the next session prepared. So thank you all for attending.
Bye, thank you.
Hello, hello. Excuse me while I put everyone in the waiting room.
Sure, take your time.
One second.